Week 1, we looked at the looping ball bounce, which demonstrated easing as well as timing and spacing. For this, we were given a still image which I used to create 2 ball paths. This was done by duplicating the still balls 24 times and placing them in the motion workspace to make them appear to be moving. For this week, since the movement of the balls was already predetermined, I decided to look at aesthetics. So for here, I decided to do a space background, which would have stars, and then down the bottom here was a lava floor, which would represent the surface of the sun. I then decided to make both of the balls asteroids, and along with the space background, would make it look like they're flying through space. From there, I recreated them as asteroids and placed them in Adobe After Effects. I then also created a space background in Photoshop, as well as a lava floor to represent the surface of the sun, which was created in Adobe After Effects. For the space backgrounds, I made the precision move to show that asteroids are moving through space. And for the surface of the sun, if we go into there, I used turbulent noise and colorama effects to make it appear as if the lava is moving. From there, I duplicated the asteroid ball movement and reflected the second ball sequence horizontally to make it look like the asteroids were initially flying forwards and then moved backwards. I then also reduced the opacity at the start of the first sequence, as well as at the end of the second sequence to make a smooth transition, as this entire animation would be repeated 3 times. Week 2 was tied with the trajectory ball bounce and looked at arcs in addition to the previously studied principles. Unlike week 1, here we could create our own ball movements, so I used the following video to analyse the movement of a handball. Although the handball is moving on snow here, this would represent similar physics to grass. After watching this video, I knew the jumps of the handball would be longer than usual, especially if it came from a more obtuse angled throw, so I created the following sketch of how I wanted it to look. I also drew this line here to follow the guides that were shown during class in week 2, as well as to give me a good idea of how it should bounce and where each bounce should be. This path also closely resembled the handball on the snow video, which I found to be an excellent example of how the ball would naturally move. From here, I created my handball through Photoshop and made it rotate as the animation played. This can be seen here, as all the spots and the pattern of the handball move as it moves along the animation. From there, I then created the path that I wanted the handball to follow, which can be seen through here, and I simply adjusted the height of each one and tried to recreate the same movement as the video previously shows in order to make it look as lifelike as possible. Next, I attached the handball to this path by simply making the ball, which is the motion, the parent of the picture. Then I also created the shadow of the ball, which then also increases and decreases the opacity as well as the blurriness as the ball gets closer and further away from the ground. I then took a photo of some clouds outside as a background and then created the grass in Adobe After Effects using hair and fractal noise. Both these background objects use the same movement effects as week 1 to create the idea that they are in motion as well as the handball, and I also made sure the handball rolled off the screen to make it look like it could repeat as many times as it needed to. The last week was tied with the material ball bounce, where we had to create 2 different ball bounces, one heavy and one light, to represent the weight, squash and stretch, and all the previous principles. For this, I chose a tennis ball and a bowling ball. I did the bowling ball first as it was the easiest of the 2. As a bowling ball never squashes or stretches, I needed to focus on the weight, which I learnt by watching the following videos. After watching the bowling ball video, I decided I wanted to make the ball stop, unlike other weeks, as it would be heavy enough to slow down naturally. I also wanted to create suspense within the animation, and so I created a bowling pin at the end, which would be knocked over and fall into the gutter behind it, as shown in the illustration, where as it falls it would not only fall into the gutter but it would also rotate to make it look more natural and lifelike. I would also experiment with different features by creating a brick wall and a wooden floor, which I've never made before. From there, I created my bowling ball as well as my other props such as my bowling pin, alley background and wooden floor through Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator. First, I created the bowling ball path, as seen here, using the same system as the previous week, ensuring the jumps are minimal and get dramatically smaller to represent the bowling ball's heavier weight. From there, I placed a bowling pin into the scene with a gutter directly behind it to make the illusion that when the bowling ball hits the bowling pin would rotate and fall into the gutter. Both the bowling ball and pin had these paths made as seen here, and then made these parents of the PNG for the bowling pin and the ball. I then also added rotation to both objects to make it look like the ball is rolling and that the pin is falling. I also added shadows to both the objects, which both used opacity and Gaussian blur to make the objects look more lifelike. Next, I placed a wood floor and brick background to make the scene look more like a bowling alley. Last, I made both objects disappear at the start of the animation, as well as at the end of the animation, so that way the animation could be looped as many times as people wanted to, and they wouldn't be able to notice the start and finish as such. This same process was then done for the light ball, which in this case was my tennis ball, where here I really emphasised using scale to show the stretch and squash of the object. Here I created the tennis ball PNG, as well as the path of the tennis ball, making sure they're really high and very, very narrow, as this is how a tennis ball would normally move, and also shown in the video just next. Then I also created the shadow, which again follows the tennis ball as it goes, and then also created court lines, the squash court, as we see here, the grass, and then using the same sky wallpaper. From there I also made the tennis ball roll off the screen, so therefore the animation could be played as many times as it needed to without seeing an obvious start and finish. Here is the reference video that I used for the tennis ball, making sure I made the first jump really high, and then to gradually get smaller, but not as dramatically as the bowling ball. For the tennis ball, with previous real life experience as well as those videos, this was the plan I made, which emphasises stretch and squash of the tennis ball, as you can see here, as it hits the ground, as well as the high and narrow jumps it would achieve. I also planned on making the tennis/squash court background to make it look like a more realistic scenario. Lastly, all 3 weeks worth of work were put into folders which had 3 repeats, and then from there were placed into my assessment 1 folder, which had the title screens, each animation, and then the change in opacity between the start of the title, end of the title, start of the animation, and end of the animation to make it look seamless. For me, I found making the asteroids quite challenging, as I frequently changed my mind about what I wanted to look like, but it wasn't an easy fix, as I'd have to redo every frame in Photoshop, and so I preferred creating animations in Adobe After Effects as I had total control over the design. In addition to this, I found the bowling ball, as well as the tennis ball, to be quite challenging, because there were so many factors that I had to put into consideration, yet it had to look realistic. So I spent lots of time redoing and remaking the trajectories for these balls to make it look as smooth as possible. This was particularly hard for the tennis ball, as the squash and stretch, as seen here, had to be modified for every bounce as the height and force constantly changed. Nevertheless, I found this whole experience really interesting, as it's something I enjoy doing and love having the complete freedom on Adobe After Effects, where you can make it look exactly how you want it to. I love the limitless possibilities with hundreds of effects and movements, which really means there's no limitations at all.